Just giving this a second, folks, for folks to get into the room before I get started. All right, folks, welcome to our fourth One Health seminar of the spring semester. I think it's still spring semester. Seems like it's going on. We just had spring break last week, and we're all kind of getting back into the swing of things here. For those of you who have not attended a One Health seminar before here at Del Val, let me kind of give you a brief introduction. Essentially, from my point of view, One Health is about everything. Uh, we live on one planet, and we are living here in conjunction with environments that allow us to survive, and with other animals in which we either depend or they in turn depend upon us. And things can either go very, very well or they can go very, very badly. And that can go from one part of this triad and become a problem for other elements of the triad. The One Health is a transdisciplinary systems approach, and essentially is just recognizing that this is one system in which we live, and we can approach problems at a local level or regionally or nationally or internationally. But we do a better job when we do that when we talk to other folks, engaging other people with different disciplines from our own, listening to what they have to say, and coming up with common solutions for the problems that are something that we all have to deal with. The way we do that at Del Val for One Health, really, One Health here at Del Val is One Health for all. It's our intent that every single student on campus get exposed to the concept of One Health, no matter what their major is. We introduce it in first year experience courses, and then it's brought into a number of other courses across the curriculum. We also have a One Health celebration every November for One Health Day, worldwide One Health Day. Would encourage student research that involves multi-disciplines as well. And then finally, outreach. And that's what tonight is, or this afternoon is about, is outreach. Our 6 seminars that are provided each year, each semester, and then also A-Days celebration, which is coming up in the latter part of April. There'll be several exhibits at that also are related to One Health. This afternoon, we are very fortunate to have Dr. Andrew Fanning here with us as our speaker. And I'm going to read from the flyer for him because I don't want to miss anything. So Dr. Andrew Fanning is an ecological economist exploring how to move our interconnected societies towards the goal of meeting the needs of all people within the means of the living planet. He is passionate about finding ways to make progress towards this goal visible in data. Andrew is research and data analysis lead at Doughnut Economics Action Lab and a visiting research fellow at the University of Leeds. His research has been published in leading journals such as Nature's Sustainability and Lancet Planetary Health. He leads the ongoing development of an interactive website that makes country-level results widely accessible, entitled A Good Life for All Within Planetary Boundaries. And he presents ideas and results regularly in different settings. We're extremely fortunate to have him with us this afternoon. And as he gives his presentation and you have questions, please place those in the Q&A. After his presentation, we'll come back to that and see if we can get some answers. Thank you so much, Dr. Fanning, for joining us.
Thank you very much, Professor Hoyt. Rich, thank you very much for having me and for the very kind introduction. I'm looking forward to speaking with you all. I'm going to share a little bit of a presentation. Should take me about 30 minutes to present some of the concepts of Doughnut Economics, some of the tools, and some of the ways they're being put into practice worldwide. So let me just jump right into it right now, and then I'm looking forward to the discussion. So As Reg already mentioned, I'm Andrew Fanning, Research and Data Analysis at Doughnut Economics Action Lab, which is an organization co-founded by my colleagues Kate Rayworth, who wrote this is now a best-selling book by the same name called Doughnut Economics, and my other colleague Carlota Sanz. And really, we exist as an organization to support and help make visible those people all around the world who are inspired by these concepts and who want to put them into action. And so I'm leading more the research and data analysis element of that. So when people come looking to put the ideas into practice from a data-led perspective, then I might provide technical support or try to explain and guide and support and so on. So let me give a grounding in doughnut economics, and then we can dive in from there. So I think it makes sense, though, to start with the type of 20th century economics that many of us have been taught. I was taught my original formation was in kind of mainstream economics, neoclassical economics, if you will. And really, let me just give very high-level introduction to these four core principles of 20th century economics. And so we think of it as the first picture, the biggest picture, what is the selfie, and what is the goal? And the first picture, I can't see the room, unfortunately, but I would ask people to put up their hands if they're thinking of economics, what is the very first image that comes to mind? And most people tend to think of this, right? That X of supply and demand, where price and quantity meet, where there's a market equilibrium. But of course, some challenges with this that have been known for a very, very long time is, of course, anything that cannot be exchanged or that cannot be put into a market or that doesn't have a price naturally is missing from this framework. So already we see some challenges. What's the biggest picture? It's this one here. It's called the circular flow diagram. It underpins our system of national accounts, which is used to calculate gross domestic product or GDP, among with other things. And it's been a useful tool, particularly it's been around since the 1930s, with the idea that everything balances, right? So if you have households and businesses, households need wages in order to purchase goods and services. There's banks, there's government, there's trade in more complicated versions. And of course, banks balance out savings with investment, or government with taxes and spending, trade with imports and exports, and so on. But of course, no model is perfect, and what is missing from this one, we'll get into in more detail in a little while, but effectively showing the economy just as a self-contained circular flow is not something that we observe in the natural world. It goes against the laws of thermodynamics. It's of course missing what's driving that circular flow. And what about the selfie? So Kate, my colleague Kate Rayworth, she realized that underpinning the ideas of mainstream economics, which has become quite abstract and mathematical for those of you who are not familiar with it, there tends to be an assumption of what has become known as economic man or Homo economicus. And she realized that he didn't actually have a portrait, and so she set out to draw it for us. And here he is, he stands alone, he's got money in his hand, he has a calculator in his head, he's got ego in his heart, and he has the rest of the living world at his feet. So Homo economicus knows the price of everything. He's constantly calculating. He's selfish. And the funny thing, not funny exactly, but the perhaps interesting thing is that this vision of who we tell ourselves that we are actually influences who we become. And there's some really interesting research showing that economics students who have been, trained in these ideas have actually been shown to be more competitive and more selfish than their peers in other disciplines. So it matters who we tell ourselves that we are. And what about the goal? Again, in 20th century economics, or the economics that is often taught, there's no strict goal when it comes to a macroeconomic system, but one of them has kind of snuck in almost through the back door. And this is the vision of it never-ending increasing growth of income, because there's an assumption that as we increase, as we get richer, then we're able to satisfy more of our needs and more of our wants, and so on and so on and so on, never ending. But of course, if we actually observe relationships between increasing levels of income and virtually everything else that matters, what we find is essentially a flattening off, that beyond a certain point, there's no question that at very low levels of income, a little bit more goes a long way. But beyond that point, you actually hit a level where increasing levels of income are no longer getting the same bang for your buck. And so at this point, it becomes more a question of inequality or so on and so on. But mainstream economics generally tends to assume that more income will lead to more and better things and better outcomes, which is not always the case. Because if we take a look at how the 21st century has began, we can see just, multiple and recurring crises that have occurred over these past 25 years. So we had the financial meltdown in 2008, which triggered a decade of austerity in many countries. I'm sitting in Spain, which was particularly heavily hit by that, but not even just 2008, in 2012, 13, 14. And just as we were getting out of there, of course, all of us have had to endure a global pandemic that occurred in 2020 with, just unprecedented and tragic loss of life and livelihoods and enduring waves of COVID lockdown over the past 5 years. We're living an age of climate breakdown and ecological disruption with greater storms and rising sea levels and many of the impacts that I imagine most of you will be aware of. And what we also see is that as movements are rising up to face these challenges, we're seeing an increasing crackdown on the right to protest, the right to disobey with nonviolent methods, the rise of authoritarianism, which is very concerning aspects of our world today. So I guess what all of these, my point is that these crises are really illustrating how interconnected we all are with each other and the rest of the living world, really, and that the impacts of these crises are heightened by inequalities of age, of race, of gender, and wealth in the global north and in the global south. And together, I think they're repeatedly telling us that the systemic shocks that we're experiencing arise out of the very systems that we have inherited from the 20th century. And so we need to reimagine what it means to achieve human prosperity in the 21st century with a vision that includes humanity not as endlessly expanding or endlessly growing with respect to the rest of the world, but actually in balance and thriving with all of our human and non-human relatives. And so the vision that we can offer for that, I think, is if we go back to one of the great economists of the 20th century, John Maynard Keynes, reminding us what economics actually is and what it's meant to do. And to me, this definition is is wonderful because he says economics is the science of thinking in terms of models, joined to the art of choosing models which are relevant to the contemporary world. So, I mean, there's science, yes, but there's also an art, there's an understanding, there's observation, and that we need to choose the best models that are relevant. And so effectively getting into Doughnut Economics a little bit, this is what drove Kate to effectively write this book. So in Doughnut Economics, she lays out 7 ways to think like a 21st century economist. So I won't go into all the detail that you can see on the slide there, but the very first one is to change the goal, to move from this vision of endless accumulation into one that's more about thriving in balance. And you'll find that thriving in balance actually looks a lot like a donut. Um, but it's also much more. There's about seeing the big picture, nurturing human nature, where we can be selfish and competitive, as economics tells us, but we can also be, of course, altruistic and cooperative. We need to work with systems, as Reg mentioned at the beginning. We need to understand how complex systems work, that there are feedbacks, that there are relationships that need to be nurtured. We should look to design to distribute and create to regenerate, and to be agnostic about growth is the final of the 7 ways. So let me explain a little bit for those who are not yet familiar about what the donut what the donut is, and we think of it as a compass for human prosperity. And the idea is that it's illustrating a goal, and that goal is to meet the needs of all people within the means of the living planet. So if we think of resource use almost emanating out from the center of this donut, we need to make sure that all people have enough in order to have access to achieve their essential needs. So we want to make sure that everyone is above that social foundation, the inner ring of the donut, where they have enough food and water and health and education and peace and justice and gender equality and housing and so on and so on. And these 12 dimensions have actually been derived from the social priorities of the Sustainable Development Goals, which means they've been agreed upon by all of the world's governments. So get everybody up over the social foundation and into that green ring of the donut. But at the same time, we don't want to go too far. We don't want to overshoot the ecological ceiling, because then we start destabilizing our planetary home. We start causing climate change or acidifying the oceans or destroying ecosystems and the critical biodiversity that they house. And these 9 dimensions on the outside of the global donut are informed by the Planetary Boundaries Framework, which is a framework developed by leading Earth system scientists, proposed in 2009, just recently had their most recent update in 2023, that aims effectively these boundaries to protect Earth's life-supporting system. So find an area where we're not at high risk of destabilizing the Earth system. But of course, this vision of the donut, which is really a Western concept. So Kate created this concept in 2011, the first version published in 2012, and it was really aimed as an input to the negotiations surrounding the Sustainable Development Goals that were occurring at the time. But of course, when you put the diagram in this way, it really becomes more about illustrating a sense of balance, is what the donut is all about. And that sense of balance is something that we and indigenous societies have known for millennia, right? And you can see this vision of balance again and again and again coming up, whether it's in the yin and yang, the 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 Celtic endless knot, and so on and so on. So what we see the donut as hopefully helping to do is almost serving as a bridge to bring a Western mindset or a Western paradigm or worldview that we've inherited over the past 3 centuries back into the much more relational and balanced and reciprocal type of worldview that many indigenous cultures have preserved and struggled to maintain in the face of really quite devastating disruption by the world, by the Western worldviews. So how can we move away from this, growth-based mentality and serve as a bridge to get back to a vision that's much more about thriving? Because when we look at how we're doing today, it's of course it's a deeply challenging picture where we have billions of people who are falling short of meeting their most essential needs, while at the same time we are now overshooting 6 out of the 9 planetary boundaries. So to me, this image, it tells us that we need to radically transform our relation with the rest of the living world, our economic systems, in order to get into the donut from both sides at the same time, which is clearly not what our current system was designed to do. So in a way, it provides a kind of almost a liberating sense, because we realize that we need to reinvent, we need to have new models and new theories and new practices and that are fit for this challenge. And it's just, I always think kind of like, if not us, then who? And if not now, then when? Like that type of mentality is what this image says to me. But of course, this is a global picture, and when we take that and we aim to actually put it into practice in our cities and our nations and our companies and our communities, then what we realize is that some important context is missing when you only look at this global picture. So one of the pieces of research that I have led together with colleagues at the University of Leeds and elsewhere has been to take this image and to apply it in a comparable framework across as many countries as we could. And we were able to look at 150 countries in a study which was published and is available on the website that you can see at the bottom of this screen there. But here's four of those donuts, and they kind of show a range. And let me start with Malawi, where you can see that, you know, with a level of economic activity equivalent to only $1,800 per person per year, we can see that Malawi is falling far short of meeting the essential needs of its residents. So there's a lot of red in the middle of that donut, but at the same time, it's not overshooting any of the biophysical boundaries that we measured for that we were able to measure. And then we have India, which is kind of still significantly falling short of meeting the essential needs of its residents and slightly beginning to overshoot, particularly the two red overshoot wedges on the outside of the donut for India, you can see are related to nitrogen and nutrient pollution, so phosphorus and nitrogen. Then you have China, which is doing, achieving more of the basic needs of its residents and starting to achieve, transgress more of the biophysical boundaries. And then finally, the United States, or I was born in Canada, which has a very, very similar picture, where you start to see relatively good social performance, at least based on this minor, quite low international standard. Although if you look very, very with eagle eyes for the United States, you can see a little red wedge there, which is related to levels of inequality that are observed, even by really quite a low standard. The United States is falling short there. But most dramatically is just radically and massively overshooting its level of pressure on the planet. So that if everyone were to live like with a level of consumption enabled by the United States economy, then there's no way that we would, have a stable Earth system. Now here are as many donuts as I can fit on the chart. And this is meant to show is effectively that there's about 50 or 60 donuts shown here. And the chart aims to show that we want to be in the upper left corner, where we're meeting the needs of all people, and we're doing so within the means of the living planet. And what we can see is that there's no nation that can put up its hand and say that it's there. Of course, some nations are closer than others. And you can see here just some little dots showing Malawi and India and China and the United States. Or here's the UK is the little blue dot together with many Western European nations. And what this really aims to show is that, that the notion of a role model is really can be radically transformed when you're taking the donut as our vision for where we want to go. That there's no kind of the Western European type of model has been relatively good for social performance, but doing so at a level of environmental pressure that cannot be emulated by others. And we should also remember that, of course, this is a national analysis, but these countries are not just isolated entities on a chart. They're deeply interconnected through histories of power and through colonialism and corporate and military power, through trade and finance rules that are almost rigged in favor of the richest. There's resource extraction and, of course, climate change impacts, which are being felt first and hardest by very often those who have contributed the least. And so this image is kind of the biggest picture that I can start to begin to show of what it means for nations and the transformative action required to live in the donut. But another way we can look at it is that it almost shows that, as I was mentioning, that curve of growth, where at the beginning we can see that growth does achieve a certain level of usually quite rapid advances in terms of social improvements, but beyond a certain point, you get this kind of leveling out. And this is the trajectory that we see here, so that countries are kind of moving up towards the donut, and then they swoosh right past. And this is a trajectory of growth that we need to turn around. And if you Yeah, if you want to see the actual data tails related to this analysis, we were able to look back as far as 1992 and see, sure enough, for virtually all nations are following this some stage along this trajectory, depending on where they are. But of course, this idea of growth, I think one of my favorite quotes comes from a systems pioneer named Donella Meadows. Many of you may have heard of her, who always reminds us to always ask when we're talking about growth. Growth of what and why, and for whom, and who pays the cost, and how long can it last, and what's the cost to the planet, and how much is enough. So every time that somebody just throws the offhand remark of growth as if it were a positive thing, then I'm reminded of Donella Meadows, and I invite you all to put this quote on your computer up above it or something so that it stays at the forefront of your mind. Now, once again, we can stick on this chart, and instead of looking at the history, the trajectory that we've had, why don't we think instead of the trajectories that are needed in order to get into the donut? And here we've identified three broad groups, clusters of countries that have different pathways in order to get into that safe and just space. So how can the low-income countries of the world, how can they rise up and radically and accelerate their levels of social improvement in order to get into the donut, but do so in a way that they don't overshoot their pressure on the planet in the way that every other nation has done before them. And the middle income and emerging nations, how can they reorient their economies and their policies almost 90 degrees so that they too can get into the donut? And critically, the high income nations of the world, like the United States, like Spain and the rest of Western Europe and many others, how can they maintain the levels of social performance that have been achieved, or even better would be to improve and improve our levels of well-being, while just radically reducing the levels of resource use back to levels that could be sustainably extended to the rest of the world. So this image is kind of these three trajectories, but again, we can't forget that there's in order to achieve those pathways, there's a rebalancing across nations that also needs to occur. And this rebalancing could take many forms. I mean, it could be a picture of reparations for slavery or for the historical wrongs committed against indigenous peoples and so on. The return of stolen land, the redistributing wealth, or redistributing technology, renegotiating trade and finance rules, and rebalancing global institutional power, whether that's through voting rights at the UN or the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund, or redefining the World Trade Organization, and so on and so on. There's much to do. So this is the type of transformative action, some examples, some directions that are meant to show that are needed both within countries, but also between them. And in order to kind of achieve this, I'm completely convinced that the economic vision, the biggest picture of the economy that we have, needs to be expanded in order to take into account the, you know, the rest of the living world, not just the economy, as Reg mentioned at the beginning. So we know that the economy is not self-contained, it's not self-powered, it's embedded in and dependent upon the rest of the living world. And this image here is what we call the embedded economy. It's also included in Doughnut Economics. And what it aims to show, of course, is that the economy is part of a political and social construct. It's part of our society, and our society is, of course, part of our finite Earth system upon which we're completely dependent for all of our living matter and materials, as well as this constant big bath of solar energy from the sun. And if we look within the economy, of course, mainstream economics tends to focus most on the market, and to a lesser extent the state, when markets kind of fail. But what we can also see is two other domains on the vertical within the economy, which are the household and the commons. And Kate put those on the vertical because they tend to be kind of have received much less attention. So almost the market and the state in the 20th century was kind of this ideological boxing match between, are you a free marketeer or like a communist? Whereas the incredibly important role of our households in getting, workers don't just show up without having gone to school, without having been cared for by their parents, by their grandparents, by their brothers and their sisters. So that role of the household in caring and making sure that people are part of a nurtured upbringing and so on is a fundamental part of actually economic, what it means to have labor show up to work every day. And likewise, the commons, like when we show up, when money doesn't necessarily change hands, but we show up as volunteers, as stewards, as co-creators, as the many, many different types of organizations that occur outside market-based spheres of interaction that really underpin so much of what it makes life worthwhile. So this embedded economy is effectively, it's an attempt by ecological economists, by Kate, to make visible these important different domains that Reg even really touched on at the beginning, that One Health, I would say, also is touching on those. I wanted to touch on one of my heroes, goes by the name of Herman Daly. He's an ecological economist, recently passed away. He's from the US, uh, who has really pioneered the entire discipline. And one of the things I wanted to share here is his 3 rules for setting scale. And I think they're just brilliant to keep in mind. And the first one is when we're using energy sources or materials, then we should, number one, use renewable sources no faster than they can be regenerated by nature. This is just a rule for staying within a sustainable level of scale. Number two, use non-renewables no faster than adequate substitutes can be developed for them. And so if we're using non-renewable energy or materials like oil and other fossil fuels, then we should only use them at a rate at which we're bringing renewable alternatives online. And third, we should create waste no faster than it can be assimilated by nature. And actually, Professor Daly, and I think he's right, argued that if we can do these 3 things, then we could actually maintain, in biophysical terms, a sustainable, steady state, a sustainable economy for the long term, just by respecting these 3 rules. Of course, we can think of how our current economic system is running and assess, and the assessment quite clearly shows that we're not respecting any of those rules, hence the big levels of overshoot that are observed in the donut. But I think that it goes even deeper than that. I wanted to share some of the insights that I think are so important that and when I say my, is kind of a Western mindset, needs to learn how to relate to nature in a different way. And when Chief Oren Lyons of the Iroquois Onondaga Nation was invited to address students at the University of Berkeley's College of Natural Resources, he said, "So what do you call resources? We call our relatives. And if you can think in terms of relationships, you're going to treat them better, aren't you? So we need to get back to the relationships because that is your foundation for survival." And likewise, Robin Wall Kimmerer, who's a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation and the author of a wonderful book, among others, called Braiding Sweetgrass, asks, how in our modern world can we find our way to understand the earth as a gift again, to make our relations with the world sacred again? I know we cannot all become hunter-gatherers, but even in a market economy, can we behave as if the living world were a gift and that we could be in reciprocity? So I think that these insights are just so important for trying to begin renaming humanity's relations with the rest of the living world, because the ways we name and engage with the living world reveal the underlying relations that we are assuming. So when it comes to the market relations, then we often hear talk of natural capital or ecosystem services. Other forms of relation are possible though. So again, if we think of the commons, then it's much more about stewardship. Or in the buen vivir and other knowledge systems with respect to the household, we could talk about Mother Earth and our relation with the rest of the living world in that way. Or from a more state-based perspective of looking at rights and entitlements and liabilities, then we can talk about the rights of nature. But my point is that the names and labels that we use to speak about the rest of the living world matter, and they can reveal what we implicitly assume about the basis of, of these relations. So let me give a bit of a high level summary of what I've been speaking about so far. So this slide contrasts two contemporary worldviews in economics. So the top row presents the implicit and explicit framing used in neoclassical economics, which is overwhelmingly still the main dominant economic school of thought in most departments of economics. And the bottom row presents the implicit and the explicit framing used in ecological economics. So the worldview, it's not economicus at the top. It's not ego, it's eco for this famous image that you can see on the left hand or comparison on the left. The goal is not endless accumulation, it's thriving in balance. The map is not a circular flow that is powered by we're not sure what. It's the economy embedded in society, embedded in and fully dependent upon the Earth system. When we think about naming, we hear in the economic mainstream paradigm, natural resources, externalities, natural capital, ecosystem services. Whereas in a much more ecocentric paradigm, you hear about Mother Nature, about the web of life, about planetary boundaries. And in practice, carbon markets, green bonds, payments for ecosystem services, and others versus carbon budgets or the rights of nature or regenerative design or reciprocity and so on. So these are a bit of a juxtaposition between the different schools of thought, which are currently kind of in tension with one another. So let me just wrap up. I wanted to share a bit more about how these ideas are going into practice in business, in government, in communities, in our own lives. And I'd like to do so by really focusing on what I've been most involved with, which has been engagement at the city level, at the city and regional subnational scale. And so when we're working with cities, we ask, what would it mean for our city to live in the donut? And to do so, we have a very big question that we present to ambitious cities, which I will, present to you here, which thinks about how can our city become a home to thriving people in a thriving place while respecting the well-being of all people and the health of the whole planet. And of course, that's quite a complicated question that you can hear various parts, but essentially at its core, it's about how can we be thriving people in a thriving place here, achieving our local aspirations, while at the same time respecting the health and the well-being of people and the rest of the non-living world while we're achieving those. So it's about a balance. And this framework really came out with work that we were doing in 2019 in Amsterdam. And they, to their credit, put the donut at the very core of their circular economy strategy. And in 2020, they published the very first kind of Amsterdam donut portrait, which actually led to quite a bit, almost immediately, Copenhagen. I think it really speaks to the power of one of our principles at Doughnut Economics Action Lab that we think are so important is the power of peer-to-peer inspiration. So I think just the fact that Amsterdam had started engaging with this concept and this different worldview leads peers, in this case in Western Europe, to say, look over and say, whoa, if they're doing it, then I could do that. And Copenhagen, within months, had passed a motion within their council to also begin engaging with the concepts of donut economics. The Secretary of State of the Brussels capital region got in touch also in 2020, very shortly after, saying, how can we apply this framework? In Barcelona, similarly, just 1 year later in 2021, they started a big process working with the local university in order to engage with the concepts. And today, well, here's the map of 2025, but to date, there's more than 90 cities and local governments that have been engaging with donut economics. I think about 50 of them are on this map, publicly working with the concepts and the tools and the policy, the policy implications in some way or another. A few examples in Glasgow, they used our tools in order to create a vision for a thriving city. So when you ask that big question that I asked earlier, you can separate it out into these 4 separate lenses and actually identify within each lens what is the vision that we want for our residents with respect to food or with health or education or climate action or welcome to immigrants, and so on and so on. And for each case, they actually articulated a vision for each of those dimensions. In Barcelona, I already mentioned they worked with the local university, but they also held some very interesting participatory workshops and really trying to create a social infrastructure and a culture of sustainability, which was already there in many cases. So what the donut often offers is a language and a framework for articulating things that many people are already aware of. It just provides a means to communicate with one another, a language to do so. In Ipoh in Malaysia, they have fully adopted the donut economics and they're aiming to be the first city in Asia that's aiming for the donut. In Thimphu, in Bhutan, for those of you who are familiar, many have heard of the gross national happiness framework in Bhutan. Well, we've been working with the city planners and stakeholders in Bhutan who have even used the term that what they're really aiming for is gross national happiness in the donut. So recognizing that balance that is already, they already had, oftentimes the ecological component wasn't as clear, and so they started to bring that in. And I should stress that all of these initiatives, we Donut Economics Action Lab, we're not going knocking on any doors. We respond by invitation, and so we're really just aiming to support people who are inspired by these concepts, not pushing them on anyone by any means. So if you wanted to learn more about some of the cities and regions stuff, my colleague Leonora Gercheva has just published a version of this report, which you can find on our platform, which highlights 12 new case studies of different city-led initiatives, as well as these 9 ways that places are getting started in much more detail. The final thing I will say is we've just released in November of last year, Kate led this work quite a lot, a tool called Doughnut Economics for university courses. And really, this is taking the concepts of donut economics and putting in the work to develop a series of modules related to each of those 7 ways, which are not designed to be, a single class gone slide by side by side, but actually they're aimed to be kind of almost plug and play for university lecturers who want to communicate some of these concepts, as well as a host of background resources and materials, so that for anyone who's interested, it's not just for lecturers. I mean, I think that student learners can pick up a lot from this tool as well. So I wanted to make you aware of that. So I'll leave it there. And I'm very grateful for the time. I feel like I've talked more than I planned, but I hope that we've given a bit of the breadth of our work. And if you'd like to learn more, please go to doughnuteconomics.org. You can become a member, share tools, stories, and thank you.
I only have one word in response to your presentation. It's wow. Wow.
I
Uh,
just bombarded you all. I'm sorry.
no, no, you did not just bombard us. You have covered so much ground, things that that we've had other speakers kind of talking about other components of this. We just had a fabulous presentation a couple of weeks ago from Dr. Jim Fenelon talking about indigenous cultures and their concerns with climate change and action and their interactions with sense of place, and how to kind of take action to get back what has been lost. Um, this is fascinating. I hope that everybody actually goes to your website, uh, doughnut right? And please put your questions into Q&A. I can't imagine that you don't have some questions. One that I have for, well, actually, we got one. And rather than me jumping into mine, let's see what we got here. So Tanya Casas asks, in interdependent, interlinked economies, can you provide an example of how those cities trying to adopt Doughnut economics have addressed CO2 emissions, for instance, with transportation in and out of cities, or another example dealing with its interconnectedness?
Hmm. That's a great example. For CO2 emissions, I guess one of the core, I mean, it's a fairly well-known example when it comes to transport is a growing number of cities going kind of car-free, and so just taking back space from vehicles, as well as uh, but I guess that doesn't really touch on the commuting element of the question. So in Amsterdam, the areas that they focused most on was more on material flows. They were looking at food and clothing and and electronics as kind of the areas that they could address most of all. I guess I can't think of any examples dealing with exact interdependence in and out of cities, because oftentimes when you're working with cities, there's certain levels of jurisdictions where usually the commuting element isn't is harder to tackle. So the way that we have, I'm not thinking of any examples right now. I'm sorry. Most of the time it's about, you know, having more dense and compact cities so that people don't need their cars. Um, and certainly recognizing the importance of commuting and going back and forth and, of course, improving public transit as the general thrust of a policy response so that people don't need to be in their cars or that we could have low carbon alternatives. One example that comes to mind is we often speak about is Curitiba, which kind of pioneered some rapid public transit. It's a city in Brazil that kind of pioneered a lot of the, building highways for buses so that, of course, it doesn't make sense to have, well, we could have one traffic jam, which would be like kind of the worst, just full of private cars. But of course, a bus stuck in a traffic jam is not much better, right? And so that when we talk about a regenerative policy, it would be how can we make it so that public transit is, faster and more affordable and better than, as well as being, emitting fewer emissions. So I guess that's one example that comes to mind. Climate action plans with the municipality. Yeah, this is one of those cases where I'm gonna, think about it in 2 hours or wake up tonight and be like, ah, why didn't I say blah? But for now I unfortunately don't have much of a good response for that. Sorry, Tanya.
I think Tanya brings up a good point with that, because I am aware of the group that she's working with, which is a local group looking at climate change kind of action plans. But I also think that her group and the community itself has been very forward looking, and that certainly Doughnut Economics might be a nice model to be pulling into all of this. Uh, Man, I am amazed that you had so many cities jumping in on this in what is really a very short period of time. Uh, Do you see this as being something that small communities, townships, small towns, starting to take on this and building it up from not only their local communities, but to counties and provinces and states, uh, and that in turn will create maybe some of the pressure that's necessary for national governments to start looking at themselves and going, do we really want to be out here, or do we want to push ourselves closer to some kind of level of sustainability in that we have this planet for a few more years?
I think there's no question that we're seeing more and more interest from national government. And I think it's my hunch, of course, it's a big, complex, messy world, but my hunch is that they are responding to the level of city and subnational interest, and taking a look to say, well, hey, this framing allows us, it's particularly the ambitious and more progressive leaders who are saying, this framing allows us to talk about things that we know are important in a way that doesn't, because especially in the political domain, you don't want to kind of give too much ammunition to be criticized. And so a lot of the work that we're doing with Doughnut Economics is trying to create new language to, instead of kind of falling back on the old isms of the 20th century. We think that's really, really important. And I think that it's beginning to resonate. There's a big fear that we have, and it's one of our core roles, is about protecting the integrity of the concepts. Because as things start getting picked up and used more and more and more, there's a big danger that we see around being co-opted, around being misused, which is, of course, not in anyone's interest. So one of the things that we've done with Doughnut Economics Action Lab is, rather than trying to be kind of, you know, very Puritan in saying like it must be done this way, we've aimed to try to build a community who subscribe to a set of principles which are derived from the seven ways of thinking, like from the book. But effectively, we're relying on the deal community to help us and let us know if things are kind of deviating outside of the transformative action that we're trying to push for. And so, uh, you know, it's a practice-oriented approach. It leads to some messy real-world situations when sometimes you can have very, very ambitious and transformative, well-meaning people who are taking the concepts in a direction that we, for example, in the world of business, we have actually put out a policy asking for no company donuts. So that we never want to just, if you want to engage with the concepts of Doughnut Economics from a business-led perspective, we have a tool. It's all about looking at the deep design of the enterprise itself through its purpose, its networks, its governance, its ownership, and its finance. And these are, core institutional kind of layers that we believe are either blocking or enabling an organization to actually transform itself, to contribute towards living in the donut. But no company donuts, just because we see the risk of, an ExxonMobil donut, or yeah, I probably shouldn't name official organizations, but you know what I mean, like a Coca-Cola or any of these just giant multinational publicly publicly traded corporations that we just don't see how their current ownership structure could be uh, aligned with the principles of Doughnut Economics. So we've actually just said, you know what, if you want to follow that route, there's plenty of other tools that people can engage with. If you want to do corporate target setting or, ESG and all of that stuff, then we were able to kind of direct that interest to others, as almost as a risk management procedure. Sorry, I kind of dovetailed off there, but I was going to get to, yes, I think that the national governments are interested due to the subnational we are seeing in the US actually, in Vermont and in California. So there's a California Doughnut Economics Coalition has just recently launched a really, really well done report um, that was published in December, I believe, that was engaging from a quantitative perspective, but as well also reaching out to community members. And I know that they're building bridges with the state level government as well, that you can they have a website and everything as well that I encourage you to check out. They're doing some really, really um, inspiring things.
Oh, do so you have all of these locations that you identified on your map. On your website, is there any linkages? I noticed that Philadelphia is one of the cities that was listed. Does it happen to have a link that would take us to more information about what is happening in Philadelphia?
Yeah, great question. So some of those initiatives have started up, and some have been continuing on and had various phases and a journey, and others are silent for the moment, which I believe is the case in Philadelphia. So
Yeah.
in Philadelphia, Portland, and Amsterdam were three of the original pilot cities of a project called the Thriving Cities Initiative, which was
Oh,
Doughnut Economics, Action Lab, the C40 Cities Network, for if you're familiar with them, but a group a group of partners worked together with those three cities to develop the very first kind of donut portraits, as we called them. Portland and Philadelphia, for various reasons, decided not to publicly make their results available, whereas Amsterdam did.
right.
And again, that once again just illustrates I think the power of peer-to-peer inspiration, essentially, because once that was out there, it really kicked off a lot of interest and attention. Also, the moment that it occurred, it was April 2020, and a lot of the media framed what Amsterdam had done as they were kind of building back better because it was the height of the first wave of the COVID pandemic. Even though that work had been ongoing for a year previous, it was just the media moment that actually, you know, garnered some interest as well, I think.
And again, going back to your diagram demonstrating those cities are not cities, those nations that are closest to being within good social components to it, but also paying attention to what's happening at a planetary level. Um, is the UN within the Sustainability Development Goals um, utilizing that diagram at all and trying to promote those nations that really are close? They're really on the cusp of getting there, and what it is that they're doing correct in comparison to, I don't want to name any names, but perhaps United States, Canada, and Australia.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think some organizations have picked it up, particularly UNEP, United Nations
Yeah.
Environment Program. They published just recently the Global Resources Outlook. It's a flagship publication they put out every 5 years, I think it is. And they engaged with a lot of these concepts. The donut has mentioned some of the framing around what we call provisioning systems and others. Um, the history, as I mentioned a little bit when I was speaking, is the original donut was submitted in the run-up to the negotiation at the Rio Plus 20 conference that was kind of laid the groundwork for the Sustainable Development Goals. And we have it on good authority that the donut was actually on the table as those were being negotiated. And of course, the donor was when Kate published this book, which was published in 2017, she updated the global donut using the now agreed Sustainable Development Goals. So it's really been we think of them like sister concepts, which of course they yeah, they have been co-evolving over the past decade.
Great. Well, we are at time, and I personally want to thank you so much for this excellent presentation. I am headed to your website as soon as I got a couple of moments here to get there. Uh, right now, I got a bunch of meetings coming up, but I'm heading there because this is some exciting stuff. I hope that many of our people on the talk today will do the same. And I wish all of you a good rest of your day. And thank you so much, Dr. Fanning.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been great. Have a great one.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Bye bye.